The German Bundesrat is a legislative body that represents the 16 Länder of Germany at the national level. The Bundesrat meets at the former Prussian House of Lords in Berlin. Its second seat is located in the former West German capital of Bonn. The Bundesrat participates in legislation alongside the Bundestag, the directly elected representation of the people of Germany, with laws affecting state competences and all constitutional changes requiring the consent of the body. For its similar function, it is often described as an upper house of parliament along the lines of the U.S. Senate, the Canadian Senate or the British House of Lords. The German constitution, however, does not define the Bundesrat and the Bundestag as the upper and lower houses of a bicameral legislature. Officially, it is generally referred to as a constitutional body, alongside the Bundestag, the federal president, the federal cabinet and the federal constitutional court. Bundesrat was the name of similar bodies in the North German Confederation and the German Empire. Its predecessor in the Weimar Republic was the Reichsrat. The political makeup of the Bundesrat is affected by changes in power in the states of Germany, and thus by elections in each state. Each state delegation in the Bundesrat is essentially a representation of the state government and reflects the political makeup of the ruling majority or plurality of each state legislature. History. The German Bundesrat was first founded, together with the German Empire, in 1871, replacing a body of the same name and with the same functions in the North German Confederation. Under the Weimar Constitution, 1919, it was replaced by the Reichsrat, whilst appointed by state governments just as today. The delegates of the original Bundesrat, as those of the Reichsrat, were usually high-ranking civil servants, not cabinet members. The original Bundesrat was very powerful. Every bill needed its consent, equaling it to the popularly elected Reichstag. It could also, with the Emperor's agreement, dissolve the Reichstag. The Reichsrat of the Weimar Republic had considerably less influence, since it could only veto bills, and even then be overruled by the Reichstag. However, overruling the Reichsrat needed a majority of 2/3 in the Reichstag, which consisted of many parties differing in opinion. So, in most cases, bills vetoed by the Reichsrat failed due to the lack of unity among the Reichstag's constituent parties. The Bundesrat met in the same building as the Reichstag and Bundestag from 1871 until 2000, when it moved into the old Prussian House of Lords in Berlin. The composition of the Bundesrat, 1871 to 1919, was as follows. Composition. The composition of the Bundesrat is different from other similar legislative bodies representing states. Bundesrat members are not elected, either by popular vote or by the state parliaments, but are delegated by the respective state government. Normally, a state delegation consists of the minister-president and other cabinet ministers. The state cabinet may appoint as many delegates as the state has votes, but may also send just a single delegate to exercise all of the state's votes. In any case, the state has to cast its votes en bloc, i.e., without vote splitting, as state elections are not coordinated across Germany and can occur at any time. The majority distributions in the Bundesrat can change after any such election. The number of votes a state is allocated is based on a form of digressive proportionality according to its population. This way, smaller states have more votes than a distribution proportional to the population would grant. The allocation of votes is regulated by the German constitution. All of a state's votes are cast en bloc, either for or against or in abstention of a proposal. Each state is allocated at least 3 votes, and a maximum of 6. States with more than 2 million inhabitants have 4 votes. 6 million inhabitants have 5 votes. 7 million inhabitants have 6 votes. Länder represented in the Bundesrat are usually summarized in three groups, depending on the parties represented in the government. The government of the land consists only of parties represented in the federal government. The land usually votes bills. Opposition. The government of the land consists only of parties not represented in the federal government. The land usually opposes bills. Neutral. The government of the land consists of parties represented in the federal government and of parties not represented there. The land usually abstains. By convention, SPD-led Länder are summarized as A Länder, while those with governments led by CDU/CSU are called B Länder. Voting. In contrast to many other legislative bodies, the delegates to the Bundesrat from any one state are required to cast the votes of the state as a single block. If the members of a delegation cast different votes, then the entire vote of the respective state is invalid. The delegates of a state are equal to one another in the Bundesrat, hence the minister-president has no special rights compared to his ministers. But it is possible that one of the delegates casts all votes of the respective state, even if the other members of the delegation are present. Because coalition governments are common, states frequently choose to abstain if the coalition cannot agree on a position. As every decision of the Bundesrat requires a majority of all possible votes, not just a majority of votes cast or a majority of delegates present, abstaining has the same effect as voting against a proposal. Between 1949 and 1990, West Berlin was represented by 4 members, elected by its Senate, but owing to the city's ambiguous legal status, they did not have voting rights. Presidency. The President of the Bundesrat is fourth in the order of precedence after the Federal President, the President of the Bundestag, the Chancellor, and before the President of the Federal Constitutional Court. By tradition, the presidency rotates annually among the minister-presidents of each of the federal Länder. The President of the Bundesrat convenes and chairs plenary sessions of the body and is formally responsible for representing Germany in matters of the Bundesrat. He or she is aided by 2 vice-presidents who play an advisory role and deputize in the president's absence. The predecessor of the current president is first, his successor second vice-president. The 3 together make up the Bundesrat's executive committee. Organizational structure. Because the Bundesrat is so much smaller than the Bundestag, it does not require the extensive organizational structure of the Bundestag. The Bundesrat typically schedules plenary sessions once a month for the purpose of voting on legislation prepared in committee. In comparison, the Bundestag conducts about 50 plenary sessions a year. The voting Bundesrat delegates themselves rarely attend committee sessions. Instead, they delegate that responsibility to civil servants from the ministries, as allowed for in the Basic Law. The delegates themselves tend to spend most of their time in the state capitals, rather than in the federal capital. The delegations are supported by the Landesvertretungen, which function basically as embassies of the states in the federal capital. Tasks. The legislative authority of the Bundesrat is subordinate to that of the Bundestag, but it nonetheless plays a vital legislative role. The federal government must present all its legislative initiatives first to the Bundesrat. Only thereafter can a proposal be passed to the Bundestag. Further, the Bundesrat must approve all legislation affecting policy areas for which the Basic Law grants the Länder concurrent powers and for which the Länder must administer federal regulations. This approval requires a majority of actively used yes votes, so that a state coalition with a divided opinion on a bill votes by its abstention effectively against the bill. The Bundesrat has increased enhanced its legislative responsibilities over time by successfully arguing for a broad, rather than a narrow, interpretation of what constitutes the range of legislation affecting land interests. In 1949, only 10% of all federal laws, namely, those directly affecting the Länder, required Bundesrat approval. In 1993, close to 60% of federal legislation required the Bundesrat's assent. The Basic Law also provides the Bundesrat with an absolute veto of such legislation. Constitutional changes require an approval with majority of 2/3 of all votes in Bundestag and Bundesrat, thus giving the Bundesrat an absolute veto against constitutional change. Against all other legislation, the Bundesrat has a suspensive veto, which can be overridden by passing the law again, but this time with 50% plus one vote of all Bundestag members, not just by majority of votes cast, which is frequent in daily parliamentary business, because most legislation is passed by a coalition that has such an absolute majority in the Bundestag. This kind of suspensive veto rarely stops legislation. As an added provision, however, a law vetoed with a majority of 2/3 must be passed again with a majority of 2/3 in the Bundestag. The Einspruch has to be passed with active no votes, so that abstentions count as votes against the veto, i.e. to let the law pass. If the absolute veto is used, the Bundesrat, the Bundestag, or the government can convene a joint committee to negotiate a compromise. That compromise cannot be amended, and both chambers are required to hold a final vote on the compromise as is. The political power of the absolute veto is particularly evident when the opposition party or parties in the Bundestag have a majority in the Bundesrat, which was the case almost constantly between 1991 and 2005. Whenever this happens, the opposition can threaten the government's legislative program. Such a division of authority can complicate the process of governing when the major parties disagree, and, unlike the Bundestag, the Bundesrat cannot be dissolved under any circumstances. Such stalemates are not unlike those that may be experienced under cohabitation in other countries. Criticism. Some observers claim that the opposing majorities lead to an increase in backroom politics, where small groups of high-tier leaders make all the important decisions and the Bundestag representatives have a choice only between agreeing with them or not getting anything done at all. The German Federalism Commission was looking into this issue, among others. There have been frequent suggestions of replacing the Bundesrat with a US-style elected Senate, which would be elected at the same date as the Bundestag. This is hoped to increase the institution's popularity, reduce land bureaucracy influence on legislation, make opposing majorities less likely, make the legislative process more transparent, and generally set a new standard of democratic, rather than bureaucratic leadership. Other observers emphasize that different majorities in the two chambers ensure that all legislation, when approved, has the support of a broad political spectrum, a particularly valuable attribute in the aftermath of unification, when consensus on critical policy decisions is vital. The formal representation of the states in the federal government, through the Bundesrat, provides an obvious forum for the coordination of policy between the states and the federal government. The need for such coordination, particularly given the specific, crucial needs of the eastern states, has become only more important. Supporters of the Bundesrat claim that the Bundesrat serves as a control mechanism on the Bundestag in the sense of a system of checks and balances. Since the executive and legislative functions are closely intertwined in any parliamentary system, the Bundesrat's ability to revisit and slow down legislative processes is often seen as making up for that loss of separation.